Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Many of you are still joining us. We've got a bit of a trickle coming in. Happy to welcome you to this webinar with the Tree Counseling Center and Connie Beefus. I'll introduce Connie just a minute here, but first I'm gonna keep clicking to let everybody in and just go through a little bit of information as you're joining. If you've been with us before, you know that well, you've got some good information coming your way from Connie. We also ask everybody to keep yourself muted throughout so that Connie has uninterrupted sharing. And then for the most people, if you keep your camera off too, it helps people in areas with lower bandwidth to keep connected. We will have the opportunity to interact with Connie at the end, as long as there's time. She's got a good amount of content for us to go over, so we'll prioritize that. But if you have questions or comments or things that you'd like to, either questions to raise or comments to make to Connie, please go ahead and send those to me via the chat throughout the webinar, and you're welcome to send questions to me throughout. Unless it, and if it's very relevant to the moment, I'll stop and ask Connie to answer then, or we'll hold it to the end. But you can feel free to send me questions as we're going. So I'd like to introduce you to Connie Beefus, who is a good friend of Olive Tree. She served on the board of Olive Tree for many years and was instrumental in a lot of good things happening here. She's done trainings and a webinar for us before as well. So this is excellent content for those of you that are either in your first term or helping people through their first term, or if you're an organizational support person helping somebody enter their first term. Connie has 35 plus, right, Connie, 35 plus years of experience herself in providing
yes.
member care and support for organizations and people. So she's got the chop. She knows what she's talking about. And that is on top of growing up herself as a cross-cultural worker, as a third culture kid in Africa, and serving overseas herself for close to 20 years, I think. So she's got a lot of information. This research, I'm sure she'll tell you about what it came out of, but it's not this content that doesn't just cover a 90-minute webinar, but she's written a book called The Sojourner's Handbook, and that's something that we recommend to clients at Olive Tree all the time. Find it very useful, and I'm sure she'll talk a little bit more about that. So yeah, in the interest of hearing everything she's got to share with us, I'll turn it over to Connie.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, or whatever it is where you are. Thank you for joining us for this topic, the crucible of the first term. And the whole idea of really looking at it is to understand what goes on in that first term and to help so that it won't be the last term. If you're attending, it's probably because you're in your first term and are finding that it's a lot of fun, but there may be some crucible aspects of it. Or you work with people who are in the first term and you've decided that you'd like to understand better what's going on. That certainly was my experience. I had grown up on the field, as Lisa said. I started out as a cross-cultural worker with my husband early in our 20s, and I found people struggling. And although I understood part of it, I wanted to understand more. I have borrowed this terminology, this wonderful metaphor of crucible, from Steve Hoke, and I thank him for the metaphor, but the material, the rest of it, is my own. The meaning of crucible is, of course, a vessel that's employed for heating substances to very high temperatures with the purpose of purifying whatever it is that's being heated, whether it's gold or silver or another substance. Crucible also can mean a severe or searching trial, and it's a very biblical metaphor, which is important to me, as it may be to many of you. One of many biblical references to crucible is Isaiah 48, 10 and 11, where the Lord says to his people, "See, I have refined you, though not as silver. I have tested you in the furnace of affliction. That's a crucible. The CEB version says the furnace of misery, and the DRC says the furnace of poverty, any of which are relevant. The Lord goes on to Israel, for my own sake, I do this. How can I let myself be defamed? I will not yield my glory to another. In other words, he refines his people so that they are purified, so that they glorify him. And I think that we certainly can apply this scripture, as well as many others, to the experience of first term. Why is understanding first term so important? What I'd like to do today is kind of take it apart for us, like the way you would take an old-fashioned alarm clock, an analog alarm clock, not a digital one, where you take pieces apart and lay them on the table and then put it back together. And that's what I'd like to do with the Crucible of first term. And it's important because it is a time of high transition and stress. So to be humane, to be compassionate and caring and empathetic and helpful, we should understand it and understand the people who are going through it. Perhaps even more important, though, is the fact that those first weeks and months and years are formative and foundational. People who are going through cross-cultural adjustment are forming new attitudes. They are making patterns of thinking and ways of behaving that they will probably follow for years. And those are hard to change later on. So as I became more and more aware of this, as I worked with people as a director of member care and in counseling, and I realized how many things went back to those first months and years on the field and how important it was to help people get it right from the beginning. And also, a lot of attrition goes back to those first years. It may not actually appear, people might not end up leaving the field until 4 or 5 years later. But if you have an opportunity to probe their thinking and what happened, sometimes that attrition could have prevented in that first term. Now, let's be fair. It isn't all a crucible. I like cross-cultural adjustment. It's fun. It's fascinating. It's broadening. It's intriguing. At times it's hilarious. I like travel. Many of you do. I like to try a new place, new food, figure out a little bit of the language and see the traditions and the way they dress. So cross-cultural adjustment is fun, except when it's not. Parts of it can be extremely difficult, down to the point of searing, painful, confusing, very, very stressful. And that can be deepening if it is taken in the right way. And of course, that's what we want to talk about. Now, how do I know? Lisa said that I grew up in Africa. I was the oldest of 6 kids. So I experienced boarding school, different languages, Mashi, Banyarwanda, Swahili. I didn't learn those. I did learn a little bit of Swahili and French. I've lived in 7 different countries and 5 states. So you can hear that I have crossed cultures a number of times and needed to understand how to do it well for my own sake and the sake of those around me. My background is that I have a master's in counseling, PhD in counseling psychology, and I am a licensed psychologist. I did my dissertation, Lisa referenced this, on culture shock. And back when I did my dissertation, that's what we called it. Now we're more enlightened and we call it cross-cultural adjustment. I've been in private practice. I am a Jesus follower. I submit everything I learn to his lordship and to the scrutiny of the truths of his word. And I've been in member care way more than 30 years now, almost 40, as doing counseling on the field in home offices, and I've been a director of member care for 2 different organizations. So that's how I became very well acquainted with what goes on in the first term and the needs for those of us who can help to do something very helpful for our first term sojourners. Now, let me explain some assumptions I have. Much of what I'm going to say applies to teenagers, adolescents, and kids, but I am talking primarily about adults. And the first term, by that I mean 2 or more years in a country that is foreign. It's not your first culture. It's not that person's home or first culture. Therefore, it involves leaving home and cross-cultural adjustment. When I was doing my research on cross-cultural adjustment, I stumbled across this word sojourner, and it's a little bit biblical in its connotation, so I liked it. And it is in anthropological circles, by the way, the correct term used for a person who voluntarily resides in a culture foreign to themselves for a significant period of time, and who, or most likely will, or can return to their home culture at some point. In other words, they're not a refugee or an immigrant, although what we're saying can often apply to immigrants and refugees. So you're going to hear me using the word sojourner quite a bit. I had to come up with a definition for my doctoral research on cross-cultural adjustment, and here is what I came up with. This is a complicated definition for a good reason. Cross-cultural adjustment, as we call it now, culture shock, is an adjustment reaction syndrome. That's a psychological term caused by cumulative, multiple, and interactive stressors at the intellectual, behavioral, emotional, and psychological levels of a person recently relocated to an unfamiliar culture. And it is characterized by a variety of symptoms of psychological distress. I'm going to pick this apart for us. So, first of all, some possible symptoms of culture shock are symptoms of stress. You're familiar with these. I was giving a talk like this in a language school in Costa Rica, Spanish language school there, and some people came up to me afterwards and they said, "Oh, Connie," they said, "we have all those symptoms." Well, bless their hearts, that sometimes happens. And you'll notice that one of those symptoms is up there 4 times, and fatigue, 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 and there's very good reason for that. Now, as I said in the definition, there are multiple levels of ourselves, of our personhood, of our well-being affected by cross-cultural adjustment. One of them is physiological. Our bodies are affected by living in a different place. Our behaviors become affected by living in a different place. Our mind and how it works, our intellectual and cognitive functioning is affected by transitioning to another place. And of course, our emotions are as well. And it's a little bit difficult to pull these different aspects of ourselves apart and isolate them because, of course, they interact together. If we have a very uncomfortable, severe headache, it affects our behavior. It affects how well we can think, and it affects our emotional selves. If we have a loss that's preoccupying us, it affects everything else. That's how we're made. So let's look at the physiological effects. First of all, there are often time zone effects and our circadian rhythms are changed. There's jet lag. We wake up at the wrong times, we don't sleep well, and so on. The climate, if we're used to a Michigan winter or a Minneapolis winter, and we go to the tropics, then it feels incredibly humid and cloyingly hot to us, or vice versa. The altitude can affect how well we work. I lived in Costa Rica for a while, and as I said, worked with language school students, and I would tell them quite correctly that they could blame the altitude for their fuzzy brainedness for about 2 weeks because there is just less oxygen in the air at 3,500 feet, but our bodies adapt. So they could only use that reason for a little while. Many of us coming from highly developed countries aren't used to the noise, the dirt, and the crowded spaces that occur in some of the countries that we move to. And there are different foods and different bacteria, and bacteria affect our gut. And as we know now, gut affects how we feel about a lot of things and how well we're doing. So our immune system and how well it performs can be affected. These are just a few of the main physiological things that affect us when we move to a completely different place, different time zone, um, and we're affected for a while. Next comes our emotional parts of ourselves. During the support raising phase before sojourners leave to deploy overseas, they often experience a loss of a normal career path. People tend not to understand why they're going overseas when it's not for tourism and it's not for fun. I had many of the candidates that I worked with report to me that people would say to them, well, are you taking your children? And they were a little bit stymied by this question. Well, of course, they're taking their children. Some of them developed some very funny and flippant answers, which they decided not to share, which was probably a good idea. But there is a loss of kind of an understandable role for many people. They begin to sell their homes, their goods, their car. They lose an anchor of a materialist state in the world. They quit jobs and they end roles that they took up for very good reasons. And this results in a changing identity. Then they begin goodbyes with family, friends, and church. Then they go overseas and they lose the actual proximity of family and friends and pastor and their church community, the doctors that they knew and trusted. Nowadays, we have the possibility of Zoom, of Skype, of FaceTime, of so many ways to actually be in touch with people. But I counsel people to be careful about that because there's still the loss of the actual presence of people, of being able to see them, hug them, smell them, spend time with them. So this is a loss. Then there are home culture customs and holidays and traditions that people begin to miss in their first year overseas, and just the presence of familiar places. Some people who are in cultures where they don't own a car, they get on buses and they walk, they miss getting in a car and just driving for miles like they used to be able to. Other first year losses. I wonder what just happened. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Are feeling fluent in the language. Unless you happen to move to a country that uses your kind of English as the main language, you often have to learn a new language and you stop feeling like an articulate adult. But many of you have done this, so you know it's not very much fun to feel like a 2-year-old when you're talking. It takes away that sense of being articulate. They lose a sense of competence in many ways. They have to learn their ways around, learn currency, learn how to do things. And then we're going to explain this a little bit more. They lose a sense of who they are. They aren't who they used to be. There's not a sense of belonging with their friends or their church community. And in some countries and cultures, things are unpredictable. It's perhaps not politically stable. And so the sojourners lose a sense of stability, security, and sometimes even of physical safety. They don't know their way around and they have to learn that. That is a lot of losses. And it isn't that any one of them ends up in a meltdown, but the cumulative pileup of all those losses really can have an effect on person in their first years and in any transition. And then there's what I call the behavioral aspect. I'm not a real strong behaviorist in terms of a psychological approach, but I do understand that when we lose positive reinforcements, we can end up feeling punished. And when a person goes overseas, they often don't have their same recreations. They have to figure out how to do exercise. Maybe going out to run around the park isn't all that possible. Maybe they can't just stop in a Starbucks and do what they used to do. They have to figure out, can they do their hobbies in this new place? They have to try new restaurants and they have to figure out how to order and what to order. And how do they get together with friends? Do they even have friends? So if one cannot do these things and experience these things that used to make life happy, one can start to feel a little bit punished. If you'll notice, all of these things, recreations, exercise, hobbies, going to restaurants, getting together with people, take energy. Remember what the most common symptom of cross-cultural adjustment was? Fatigue. So ironically, it takes energy to begin to rebuild or to build new reinforcing behaviors in the new environment. And sometimes energy is exactly what a person doesn't have. Then there are the intellectual aspects. A new language often needs to be learned. And not only a new language, even if the language is a kind of English, there are new gestures, directions to learn, currency, customs, how to shop, how to cook. You know, the Lord God made our brains with this wonderful feature called automaticity. And it's the ability of our brains to learn a sequence of behaviors. And once that sequence of behaviors is very well learned, it becomes automatic. And that means we don't have to think about it anymore. Those of you who type, all of you type. You know that you type along, taking notes or creating a letter or an email, and you don't think about where to put your fingers and you don't think about how to spell something until you approach a word or a name you don't know. And then you have to slow down and think about it. And when you think about it, your fingers often get messed up. Or those of you who have driven a non-automatic car, a manual, you know how to shift the gears, you get used to a particular car and you don't think about it anymore. And the simple truth is if you stop and think about how to go from first to second gear or second to third, you mess up because your brain has put it on automatic. Well, it's a wonderful feature the Lord gave us, but when we move, we lose automaticity in a number of ways. So we have to figure out how to get somewhere. We have to figure out the currency that's in our wallet. We have to figure out how to translate things. We have to figure out how much an item in the grocery store is worth in our currency so we can figure out whether we want to pay that amount in the currency of the land. So we have to think through a lot of things that we used to have on automatic. Then there are cultural assumptions to learn and unlearn. Let me give some examples. In every culture, there's a certain amount of space around us that we're used to. In generally speaking, in a Caucasian, Western kind of culture, we like a good 24 inches around us. Somebody gets closer than that, they need to be a loved one, a family member, a colleague who's very well known, or else we feel kind of intruded upon and maybe even attacked. That's our assumption about space. Some of you have lived in Latin America or India, and you know that our assumptions about space are not held there. People get much closer to each other in Arabian or Spanish cultures, and one has to get used to that. I remember standing in a bank line and thinking, why is that person's umbrella poking my back? Do they want me to move forward? I can't move forward. No, they were just used to a smaller space bubble. And if you have driven in these countries, you're aware that the space bubble around cars and vehicles is much smaller as well. And then there are cultural assumptions about time. I learned in Latin America that mañana doesn't mean tomorrow. It just means not today. If the mechanic that I take my car to says that the car will be ready mañana, I should maybe call tomorrow and find out, but there's a very good possibility that it will not be ready. So there are different assumptions about time, space, about how we lose face, about what we mean by our word. And there are different assumptions about in matriarchal cultures, in patriarchal cultures. There are different assumptions about gender roles. And it's not necessarily easy to learn these things. Sometimes we have to realize that our home culture view is not necessarily the right view, but only a view. So we have to be able to switch the way we look at things between multiple paradigm shifts. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. But I have described a little bit for you the physiological aspects of crossing into another culture, behavioral aspects, the intellectual and the emotional. I want to be sure and say that the spiritual aspect is affected as well. When we are questioning our own identity, when we are feeling multiple losses, that can often affect how we feel about God. Sometimes we have to rethink some of our spiritual assumptions as we're rethinking some of these other things. And we would like to think that the way we think about God and the trust we have in Him will infuse all of our other reactions, and it should, but sometimes it doesn't. So sometimes we need to work on that as well. No wonder then that we can have all of these symptoms, excuse me, as we experience the physiological, the behavioral, the intellectual, and the emotional aspects of cross-cultural adjustment. I wanted to share with you this U curve of about cross-cultural adjustment. This is an old study. You see there, Gullhorn, 1963, which that is an amazingly old study. The value of this study is that it has been replicated so many times. What Gullhorn did was they studied Fulbright scholars who went overseas for 2 years. And they found, you see here on this axis, we have satisfaction. And this axis, therefore, with Fulbright scholars was 2 years. And at first, they had their regular sense of well-being. They were fairly satisfied with their lives. And that dropped off rather precipitously and then gradually went back up. And by the time the Fulbright scholars returned to their home culture, it was back up to their former level. As I said, this study has been replicated. And although I have not gathered data, I'm going to share with you my own version of it. Now, to get this on a PowerPoint slide, I had to scrunch it a bit. And you'll see that it goes, the actually satisfaction of life goes up a little bit at first. You know that we all have a honeymoon period when we go overseas. We're so delighted to finally get there. It's so much fun to eat the food and see the different colors and hear the music. But then it is fairly normal for that to drop off over time as the emotional, intellectual, physiological, and behavioral elements begin to impact our sense of well-being. And while the Gullhorn study had a nice, neat U curve there, my own experience for myself in adjusting to a number of different cultures and subcultures and helping other people go through it is that the adjustment is bumpy. It's not a nice, smooth curve. And there is, of course, this dotted red line here, which represents a number of people who don't adjust well, unfortunately. Their curve of well-being doesn't go up. Some of these are people who end up in what we call attrition. They end up leaving the field and going back wherever home is. And if that's what's necessary, then that's what's necessary. Sometimes those of us in member care and counseling are called upon to help them do that. There's another class of individuals, though, who stays on the field and they have not adjusted well. And they end up being often a thorn in the side to their colleagues or to the people that they work with. And this, of course, is what we want to avoid. I want to take those graphs apart a little bit. And this is now, I want to be careful and share with you that this is not based on data. I don't want to misrepresent this as research based on research based on data. It's impressionistic. It's based on what I've gone through and what I've seen many people go through. And I would say that the physiological aspects of cross-cultural adjustment are what we recover from first. Our body was made by our wonderful creator to adapt, and it does. So we get used to the heat, we get used to the jet lag, we get used to the noise, and we have some bumps, especially if we get sick as part of cross-cultural adjustment or just part of life. There can be a real low there. But over time, our bodies adjust to the new place that we have moved to. The emotional adjustment, there, first of all, there's that honeymoon phase, the euphoria of getting there. And then we begin to feel some of the losses, but we aren't feeling the loss of identity, and we haven't missed some home culture things so much. But it can get pretty low when we haven't really gotten used to our new place, haven't built in behavioral ways of feeling good. We're missing things. And so we can go up and down emotionally over time. Behavioral adjustment really depends on the person's initiative and creativity in finding ways to enjoy their new culture, getting exercise into their lives, hobbies, figuring out how to go out, meet people, and have fun. So it's a bit bumpy, but if they get past that, then their behavioral adjustment can be pretty good. Yes, we can help them with that if we know how to do that. The intellectual adjustment begins with, first of all, we've got to get some things on automatic. We need to learn our way around, figure out the currency, figure out how to get to doctors when we need to, get some of those automatic things into our lives, and automaticity, fortunately, takes over. Then we start dealing with some of the assumptions about culture. How come we're not really getting what's going on here when somebody said they were going to meet us and they're not? Or we thought we invited them over and they don't show up. Or we thought we were beginning a good and meaningful relationship and it fell apart. And those have to do with really understanding the language and the culture and how we need to behave. So I have portrayed it as quite bumpy here. Now, just for fun, let's do it all at once. This is the physiological, this is the emotional, this is the behavioral, and this is the intellectual. What a mess. And you can see that in the middle here, there's kind of a down time on all of them. And that is one of the hardest periods for our sojourners to get through. Okay, there are some factors that affect the severity of the curves and the symptoms. First of all, whether you have to learn a foreign language or not, and how difficult that foreign language is. I was very blessed because I grew up with a little bit of Swahili and some French, and then my husband and I went to Latin America, and Spanish is, they say, one of the easiest languages to learn. So I found it difficult enough, I will say to you, but at least it wasn't Chinese or Russian or Hungarian, because those are very difficult languages. And so they add to the depth or the lengthening of cross-cultural adjustment. The level of development in the environment, and when I say development, I mean, can you drink the water? Can you depend on the electricity? Is there good broadband? Is there good health care? The harder any of those things are for the sojourner, the more difficult their adjustment is. And then, is the sojourner in an urban or rural environment? Or even more importantly, did they come from an urban environment and move to a rural one? Or did they come from a rural environment and move to an urban one? What they are used to and what they are ready for affect how quickly they will adjust. And then the socioeconomic level of the target population. If, let's say, the sojourner is a university professor who's been working in University of Washington and moves to a European or Asian or Eastern country, and they're working again with the university population, that is easier than if they're working with a very poor population. So it's the socioeconomic level the sojourner came from, the one they're accustomed to, and the socioeconomic level that they're interacting with and that they're living in and among. And then there's the rapidity of adopting an identifiable role. What I mean by that is if you've got a surgeon who's moved from a city hospital to an African country and he's doing surgery in the capital city, then he has an identifiable role. He is still a surgeon. He may have to learn a foreign language. He may have to learn a whole different way of doing things. He may not have the level of equipment and technology that he's used to, but his role is understandable to him and it's understandable to everybody around him. The same can be said of a teacher who moves perhaps from their home environment to teaching in an international school. They still have an understandable role, but other people move to a role that's very different from the one they had, or it's not well understood in the culture that they're moving to. Therefore, it's hard for them to introduce themselves and explain who they are. And then there is the status of the role in the host culture. To take the examples that I used, the surgeon has pretty good status in almost any culture in the world. So he or she is highly respected. However, if somebody is a youth pastor in the home culture where that is some understandability and perhaps some prestige and moves to an environment where that role is not understood at all and isn't exactly to be adopted again, then that is a role that is hard for the person to explain or that they miss. I would say then that our first term sojourner has 7 tasks based on this alarm clock that I've taken out and laid out on the table in front of us. And now we're going to look at the 7 tasks that they have based on what we have learned. They need to manage stress. Now, we have lots of wonderful research and books today that explain that stress is good for us. And I will agree, it is. In fact, without any stress at all, life is pretty boring. So we want a little bit of stress in our lives. But the simple truth is that when stress gets to a pretty high level, it causes symptoms of fatigue, headaches, abdominal distress, all kinds of things. And therefore, we need to recognize it and manage that stress. We need to build behavioral reinforcements into our new life. We need to grieve the losses. We need to retrain our brain in some important ways. In the middle of all this, we need to maintain and still promote spiritual formation. Because for most of us, many of us, the reason we are taking this trip and doing these things is profoundly spiritual. We need to figure out our new identity. So I call it re-identifying the fundamental identity. We need to learn how to incorporate rest and manage pacing. These are the 7 tasks. Now I'm going to talk about them. So one of the first tasks is to recognize our own cues and symptoms of stress. If I ask you for a minute, what makes you realize that stress has been kind of high of late? For me, it's often tension right here. I can feel it. For some people, it's headaches. For some people, it's back pain. For a lot of people, and maybe for me too, it's irritability. We just don't function with the customary calm that we like to think that we have. We tend to snap at each other or to just get more annoyed more easily. Whatever the person's cues are or yours, it's good to recognize them and to realize that they are kind of a call to us to apply or learn coping skills. So one of the coping skills that I often teach people is deep breathing. Just breathing deeply counteracts anxiety in absolutely marvelous ways and can settle us down. One of the beauties of deep breathing is that we can do it anywhere and nobody even knows what we're doing. In a doctor's office, before an appointment, before a speech, we're dealing with frustrating transportation systems. We can take a deep breath and settle ourselves down. I also teach progressive muscle relaxation. Many of you know that just taking a pause for a cup of tea or lying down for a minute or listening to some music, whatever it is that lowers our stress, we need to do that. Sometimes it's rest, sometimes it's exercise, sometimes it's recreations, hobbies. Um, Sometimes it's reaching out just to talk to somebody who will understand and being able to vent a little bit. It often involves making sure that what we're saying to ourselves about how we're doing and how we feel isn't undermining what we're doing. Using good biblical self-talk like, well, I knew that I would be called into some stress. The Lord promised that he would be with me. I'm going to trust him for this and lean on his strength, that kind of thing. It's good to have some memorized scriptures that are handy right there in our brain that we can use to settle ourselves down. So scripture and scriptural music can be good means of managing stress. Sometimes I've found that sojourners need encouragement to do this. To me, it seems kind of automatic, but it's almost as if they need permission to recognize their own stress, slow themselves down, take the rest they need. And I'm sure you can think of other things that you use to manage stress and that you can encourage other people to do. Building in new behavioral reinforcements. I've got a Starbucks coffee cup there because lots of people head to Starbucks for a happiness break, get their favorite coffee or drink or whatever it is. If Starbucks exists in the countries where our sojourners are, then they can do that. If not, then they probably need to find a different kind of cafe or coffee place, or maybe they need to adapt to tea if they're in Asia. But they need to intentionally explore new reinforcers if the old ones cannot be found. If the old ones, if you used to play racquetball and you can still play racquetball, good, go for it. If you can take a walk in a comfortable place without danger of getting run over by cars and so on, then good. But sometimes we have to explore new reinforcers. When my husband and I moved to Colombia, South America in our mid 50s, it really wasn't safe to walk around the streets and actually even in the country. And walking is my exercise of choice. And it's not only exercise, it's seeing the green and the sky and the flowers and the birds and everything. That was not possible. So I had to figure out new ways to exercise right in my apartment and had to find ways to do it and different ways of getting to experience the outdoors that were safe in a country that was overrun with guerrillas and actually at that point in time wasn't very safe. But it was a great reminder to me of how we have to adapt. The things that we used to do, we perhaps can't do any longer, but we have to find new ways to exercise, new foods that we enjoy, new hikes, new restaurants, new hobbies. I like to go to markets. For some people, they're a little overwhelming and overstimulating in foreign countries, but I thought they were fun. So as long as I knew that I couldn't be pickpocketed and I couldn't be kidnapped, then I would go enjoy markets. So we have to figure those things out, and it takes time. And we need to be careful about the consuming power of technology, because when you're in a new country and you don't have new relationships, it's easy to fall back on old relationships and to do your games or read your news or do the social media that's on your phone. And while a certain amount of that I think is healthy, I mean, those things, if they're fun and they're rewarding, they're part of what I'm talking about in rewarding behaviors. But if we expend all of our energy and brain power on our devices doing things that are old and well known and comfortable, then we may not have the energy that we need to reserve for exploring a new environment. So there is some balance there between the two that we need to find. And sometimes we need to help new sojourners figure that out. I encourage compartmentalizing for sanity. And when I say compartmentalize, I mean that it's a good idea to encourage people to choose certain times of the day or days of the week that they devote to learning the new environment. And they don't pay much attention to their comfortable social media and games and things on their phone. But then maybe every evening or every other evening, they give themselves 2 hours to catch up with friends, do FaceTime, play games, whatever it is. But they don't let this wonderful little device and the things that are old and comfortable run their lives. They learn to manage it. Grieving losses. Actually, grieving is a skill that can be learned. The feelings come when we have a loss, but learning how to deal with them is something that we can learn how to do. When there are a lot of losses that don't necessarily make us break down and cry, as occurs in a big transition or moving overseas and cross-cultural adjustment, we can feel kind of a cumulative sadness, maybe anger or resentment. And we need to pay attention to that. And then take time. Many of us need to find solitude. We need to get away from people so that we can think. We can think about the losses that impact us. Some of us are external processors. We maybe are extroverts. We need a person to talk to, somebody we can trust, who's not going to think that we're losing it. For sojourners, this is sometimes a challenge because if they take a friend from back home, the friend might worry about them a lot and think they're not doing well in their cross-cultural adjustment. So it really depends on the friend. Choose somebody you can trust. So we need to make time, either find solitude or have someone who gives us permission to feel our losses, and we need to reflect on them. What is the cost? Grieving is good to do. You might think that it makes us depressed, but usually not, because grieving, as we analyze the losses, think about them, think about what they cost us, we begin to accept them. We absorb a loss into part of who we are without it dominating who we are. And this needs to be a prayerful process. We can do our grieving and our mourning with the Lord, telling him how much this loss hurts, that we didn't know it would be this hard. And he comforts us because he understands. When we grieve and absorb a loss, that allows room for new emotions and experiences. Not doing the grieving actually takes up emotional energy so that we don't have energy to then be open to a new experience. Therefore, I say that grieving is a crucial element of the crucible, and those have the same root word for very good reasons. We need to learn how to grieve so that we accept the losses as part of what we're called to and part of who we are. And then they don't have to dominate us and cause irritability and sadness. It's not that they're gone exactly. They're still there, but they don't take up as much real estate in our emotional space and in our minds. We need to retrain our brains in a number of ways. First of all, as I've explained to you, we need to retrain it in the ordinary daily tasks until automaticity is working. Um, there are a number of ways that we can be proactive about doing this. We can sit down and learn vocabulary words and verb conjugations. We can practice with the currency. We can learn things on automatic faster if we work at it. I explained some of this in the Sojourner's workbook that Lisa mentioned. Language, learning the language takes up a lot of real estate in a brain, and we should expect to be tired sometimes just from that. And then we need to understand and accept new assumptions about life. I mentioned space and time, gender roles and authority, how to get things done. All of these things we need to learn about. You know, in his wonderful book, I'm blocking on the name right now, but Craig Storty talks about learning a culture. And he says, when we come up to an assumption that we don't understand that's driving the behavior of the host people of the country, we often feel a sense of discomfort because we don't understand what's going on. And it's natural to withdraw from that discomfort and just not want to encounter those situations again. But if we do that, we won't learn. So we need to embrace that discomfort. An example in Latin America is the whole truth versus courtesy conundrum. Because in Latin America, for example, if we would invite somebody over to our house for dinner, and we'd say Monday night something, and then they might not show up, and we'd be puzzled, like, what? How come they didn't show up? And we gradually learned by talking with them about it and with people who had more experience in the culture that you need to be very specific about an invitation and you need to reiterate it. Otherwise, it's simply perceived as a courtesy. So in Latin America, people can say yes to all kinds of things they don't necessarily mean. And we might view that as lying coming from another culture, but they don't. So one has to learn in indirect ways to understand when they're saying something they mean and how to figure that out. This is one of those assumptions that's a cross-cultural thing that can take a lot of time and discomfort to learn, and we need to do that. His book is called The Art of Crossing Cultures, and I encourage you to read it. It's a very good read. We need to be able to switch paradigms from our own culture, for example, how a person handles commitments and truth versus courtesy in the United States to how somebody handles it in Latin America. We need to understand our own cultural paradigm and the paradigm of another culture. So a sojourner needs to be able to enter all these different paradigms, understand them, and then switch as needed. Just for fun, here's a visual paradigm shift. Many of you have seen this before. Some of you are going to see an older lady. And if you're seeing the older lady, this is her nose, and this is her mouth, this is her chin. Some of you are seeing a younger, more elegant woman in that. Whoops, sorry, let's go back. In that case, this is her eyelash, this is her ear, this is her chin, and this is some kind of fur coat she's wearing. And can you switch back and forth between one paradigm to the other? Well, that's a paradigm shift. Here's another one. This one's more verbal from the old Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. Calvin says to Hobbes, who is his stuffed tiger, who's not really alive, but in Calvin's mind, he is. So Calvin says to his stuffed tiger, Mom wants to know if we'd like to go to the zoo today. And Hobbes says, can we tour a prison afterwards? Paradigm shift. I love it. Humans go and look at animals behind bars. Paradigm shift. Go look at humans behind bars. So Calvin goes to his mom and says, no thanks. Those are just little examples of paradigm shifts. Whereas in cross-cultural transitioning and adjustment, we need to understand our own home culture, our assumptions about male and female roles, our assumptions about what's valuable, our assumptions about time and space, and responding to invitations. And we need to develop more and more and more an understanding of the host culture assumptions. And because we will remain people who relate to the home culture and our host culture, we need to be able to switch gears like that and know which paradigm we're operating in. And even more than that, we need, as God's people, I firmly believe, to submit the home culture to God's values and the host culture to God's values. Some of my home culture values, I don't think line up very well with God's values. And I have to figure out how to be his person in my home culture. Then there's the host culture. In some cases, we might find, as I sometimes did, the friendliness and the generosity of the poor people in Latin America seem to line up with God's values much better than some other values I know of. Other values in the host culture we're working with will not line up with God's at all. And we, as his people, have to figure out how to interact with those. If you think that takes a lot of thinking and prayer time, it does. It takes a lot of reflection. And that is why we don't adjust to a culture right away. It takes time to think these things through. And it explains something I stumbled across in my doctoral research. I was reading along and I found this quote from Rubin and Keeley. The conclusion that the best behaviors for cultural adaptation and successful interaction are also those that are likely to bring about culture shock, meaning symptoms of stress, was substantiated in a study by Rubin and Keeley in 1979. The authors found that persons who were most aware of the personal and subjective nature of their perceptions, knowledge, values, biases, and so on, experienced the most intense culture shock. This means, ladies and gentlemen, that the uncomfortable part of adapting to another culture is a good thing. It's not pleasant, but it's good because it means people who are sensitive to the vibes that they're not getting something right and pay attention and realize that acting the way their culture tells them to is not working in this situation, and they need to learn a new way of acting to fit into the culture they're in, they are going to adapt best. So the authors conclude, it may be that in some cases at least, the persons who will ultimately be most effective in that new culture can be expected to undergo the most intense culture shock during transition. Yay. We need to embrace the discomfort in order to learn, in order to be more effective. So, as Anderson said, the cultural sojourn is a voyage that can end in the resocialization of the sojourner. We become, to a certain extent, different people. I hope more broad-minded, more accepting, more empathetic, more able to understand what's going on in another person, and therefore how to be helpful to them. Or in Rudyard Kipling's words, all good people agree, and all good people say, all nice people like us are we, and everyone else is they. But if you cross over the sea instead of over the way, you may end by, think of it, looking on we as only a sort of they. So the learning process is arduous, but very important. In the middle of all that, it's so important that our sojourners maintain spiritual disciplines. And when we're under stress, let's be honest, sometimes our spiritual disciplines are some of the first things that go out the window. It's when your brain has fatigue, it's not easy to continue to do a Bible study. But Sojourners need to continue growing spiritually, even as they are doing stress management, building new behaviors, grieving, and retraining the brain. In fact, each of those things, how we deal with stress, what behaviors are we going to engage in this new place? How are we going to grieve the losses? How do we absorb these new assumptions? All of them need to be done prayerfully with the help of the Holy Spirit. And I always urge people to memorize scripture because it's such a wonderful thing to do. It means that we have that scripture in our head. First of all, when it's in our head, it trickles down to our heart. We marinate our being in that as we memorize it, and it starts changing us for the better. The transformation that Romans 12, 1 and 2 talk about. And also it's just so available. We can wake up and without turning on a light or a device of any kind, we can start thinking and praying God's word. So I encourage that very much. Our sojourners also need to creatively incorporate rest and pacing. I don't know what you're finding with people who are arriving on the field today, but I found people often very stressed and not good at knowing how to do Sabbath. And I think the practice of Sabbath is something that God gave us as a gift and as something that He wants us to do. It also needs to be said that when one is involved in ministry, one has usually very unusual hours. There's generally not such a thing as an 8 to 5 job or a 40-hour week. It's very different from that. And so figuring out how and when to do any kind of Sabbath takes considerable dedication and creativity. But I really encourage people to do that. I myself am not legalistic with myself. It doesn't have to be an exact 24-hour period from Friday evening to Saturday evening, sunset to sunset, which is how the Israelites did it. Although that's a good guide. If we can do that, that'd be excellent. But I encourage many people I've worked with who've been in burnout to figure out what day or what 2 days can they devote to doing Sabbath, which means not doing work. Whatever it is that drains us and exhausts us and makes us irritable, we need to stop doing those things. And for parents with young children, this is really a challenge. How can they figure out how to give each other time off and yet still do a wonderful job of taking care of those kids? People also need to make vacation and time off enough of a priority. Sometimes the cost and logistics of really getting away from work and ministry are very hard on the field. But I encourage sojourners in their first years to establish some good parameters on how to do this so that they continue to do that. In fact, I encourage them to think a great deal about pacing. And that is, how are they going to manage the intensity of their lives? For example, let's say you've got a short-term team coming and you know all the things you have to get done before they come, and then there's taking care of them for 10 days, and then they're going to leave and you're going to catch up. So that's it's a lot of wonderful stuff, but it's a lot of high intensity. And I encourage people to think about pacing prayerfully as an administration of competing imperatives. Because we have the imperative of what we have gone to the field for, what we do for the Lord, how we serve others. But we also have the imperative of the Sabbath that we should, I personally believe, pay attention to, and the care of our body, which is our only instrument for serving God. So those are competing imperatives. We need to prayerfully administrate the care of our body and our service in the name of Jesus for the sake of the gospel, which means looking ahead and planning realistically for a long term. If you have a very intense time coming up, take some time off ahead of time, even though that's kind of counterintuitive. Plan for 2 days after an intense time, not to try to catch up on everything, because we're supposed to be living sacrifices, not burnt sacrifices. Now we come to the identity. I think most people, somewhere in those first 2 years, struggle somewhat with who they are now that they have finally arrived and they're struggling with language. And part of it relates to what their identity used to be. It usually, the concept of one's identity gets blurred and ambiguous during the support raising phase. After all, one isn't maybe a youth pastor or a teacher or a nurse practitioner any longer. One is an international worker, whatever that might be in other people's minds. And for the first term sojourners, some stripping of identity occurs. It's almost inevitable. I'm going to explain what I mean by stripping in a minute. But how much stripping of that original concept of oneself happens depends, again, on how difficult the language is, how Western the new culture is, how much is it like the culture the sojourner came from, and the level of development there. A lot of what we think about ourselves gets affected by what other people think of us, whether it should or not. That often happens. So, who are we in this new place? Has to do what the first termer, the sojourner, was used to, and also what they want or expect. Sometimes we aren't really aware that we expect something until we don't get what we expect. And then we start to feel dissatisfied and to wonder why we're not doing well. As I said before, identity and our own self-concept has a lot to do with whether we step into, as a new person in a new culture, an understandable role or a valued role. Other possibilities in regard to role are they're ambiguous. As many of you have probably experienced, sometimes there's a big gap between what you thought you were going to do and said you were going to do while you were raising support. And when you finally got to the field, that ministry or that role had evolved, or in some cases disappeared, or changed, or it was different. Sometimes the role is very clear, sometimes it's ambiguous, sometimes you don't really know what it is until you get there and figure it out. Sometimes you know what your role is as a sojourner, but the people around you don't know what your role is and aren't going to. And sometimes the role you have causes danger or insecurity for you. In addition to that, there's the stripping that I mentioned. I want you to think of a valuable wooden antique. It can be a table or a dresser. And if we strip it, we apply very unpleasant chemicals to take off the finish. Sometimes there's sanding, sometimes there's even the use of a chisel to get down to the original wood. The basic piece of furniture doesn't change, but much about it is going to change. If you're that piece of furniture, it's not necessarily a very comfortable process. Often, as we adjust to a new culture, we lose the sense of being valuable, of being worth very much, of being useful to this culture. That may come in the future, but in the process of learning the language, learning our way around, and learning to understand the culture, most of us go through a phase where we don't feel like we're worth much. We don't have much of a status or prestige. In fact, sometimes we're helpless. We don't even know how to find something we're looking for in the hardware store. We don't know how to get across town. We don't know how to find a good doctor. Unless that doctor speaks our language, we don't know how to explain very well what's wrong. So we can feel pretty downright stupid. In fact, we sometimes feel really like nobody. Like perhaps the Lord has brought us to this place to work on our character, which is happening and which is a good thing. We maybe need to be humbled. We need to find out that we are no one and nothing, and that we are utterly dependent on Him for any strength to go on. It is often during this phase that if somebody hands the sojourner a ticket back to their home country, they will take it. They will take the ticket and be gone. And many of us have been in that spot, sometimes more than once. It's also the time when it's easy to have a serious health problem or a child's educational issue be the reason to step off the field and go home. And sometimes those reasons are genuine ones, and sometimes a person is what I like to call called off the field. Sometimes that's appropriate. But often it's not. It's that the person needs to go through the spiritual crisis of being willing to be no one and nothing, and to recognize that, in fact, God does not need us to accomplish His work. He's perfectly capable of accomplishing His work without us, and maybe He would do it better without us. But if He called us to this work, I think we still need to obey. Not because we have high prestige, high status, or are good at what we do, but because He has called us. And if it's not Him who's telling us to leave the field, we need to go through this identity experience, learning that, in fact, being dependent on Him is the best place we can be. So one of the great things about cross-cultural service is that it keeps us on our knees. And that's where we most need to be anyway, is dependent on Him and having our identity hung right here with Jesus on the cross. So this is one of the most important things that sojourners need to learn. And I think we need to learn it sometimes over and over in our cross-cultural ministry life. Now, how can we help sojourners? First of all, we need to look for the right qualities. I look for a strong sense of calling, patterns of perseverance, strong spiritual disciplines. I like people to already have a theology of suffering and to have shown an ability to ask for help when they need it. I don't wish failure or suffering on anybody, but if they have experienced it, then I know what they're made of, which is very helpful. In other words, when God has called us into a place of brokenness, and then we depend on Him, He can create something beautiful out of that brokenness. This is the Japanese art of kintsukuroi, where a broken vessel is made more beautiful in its brokenness. When I see that in candidates or people who want to go overseas, then I can think that they probably have what it takes. As a psychologist, I'll say briefly that I watch out for diagnosed polar disorders and personality disorders. Some people with obsessive compulsive disorder, speaking right now to those of you in member care and with counseling background, if the obsessive compulsive disorder can be managed with good counseling and medication, then I have seen people actually thrive on the field. Patterns of conflictive, withdrawn, isolated, or histrionic behavior. When I see those in people who want to go overseas, they always concern me. Also, a history of anxiety, depression, addiction of any kind, eating disorders, abuse, or dysfunctional family. But the important question is not, is there a history of these things, but how much recovery is there? And how much help are these people going to need? Also, we can help first-term sojourners by doing a lot of pre-field teaching. Teach them stress management, appropriate self-care. Help them think about what behavioral reinforcers they have in the home country. Which ones can they take with them? Which ones will they want to explore once they're there? The importance of spiritual disciplines and keeping them present even during times of transition and stress. The importance of spiritual warfare needs to be recognized. I like people to have worked on a theology of suffering, and we can teach them how to be resilient and give them permission and encouragement to develop good patterns of Sabbath and rest and pacing. They should read about the movement history, self-care, boundaries and margins, third culture kids, cross-cultural adjustment. They can read about a lot of this stuff and learn good stuff ahead of time, but there simply are limits to what can be done pre-field. Oh, one more thing. The Crucible often involves friendly fire. And by friendly fire, I mean criticism from our friends, our supporters, our colleagues, our coworkers. This can catch people by surprise, but it is actually part of it's an occupational hazard. Now, helping people once they get to the field. One of the things that can be done that I encourage is to gather a small group of 8 to 12 sojourners, people who are somewhere in their first year, maybe even their second, with a seasoned and compassionate veteran to facilitate the discussion, meet weekly or bi-weekly, and talk about stress management, grieving the losses, the cross-cultural assumptions, all of these 7 tasks that I've talked about. This can be done online in a chat group. It's best in person, but I think we need to be creative. And it can be a support group format. One of the best things about having first-term sojourners talk with each other is they realize that their problems and challenges are common. They're not unique to them. They are not a failure because they're feeling stressed or because they're grieving. It's normal. Other people are going through it. You can use the Sojourner workbook that I wrote for this. This is what I wrote it for. So here's what it looks like. It's available on Amazon.com. It's available from Barnes and Noble. It's available from Pioneers, and it's available from Book Depository for no shipping anywhere in the world. And I made it a workbook because I wanted people to apply what is discussed in each chapter. Another thing we can do here's something about choosing the veteran workers who help the new sojourners. Some of them are naturally empathic and very helpful. Others, not so much. So choose people to help your sojourners who are naturally empathic and have not forgotten how hard their first term was. Some things an agency can do is they can provide retired veterans who get to know the sojourners either through chats or FaceTime or in person, and then hold them from a long distance by a nice strong rope of prayer and contact and understanding what they're going through. When I say veterans, I mean people who have gone through cross-cultural adjustment and won't be surprised by what the sojourner is going through. First term relief was a term that I used in one of the agency I worked with for providing funds. The people had to raise the funds. These sojourners had to raise the support for it. But that meant that when there was a first term debriefing retreat offered in their area, they could go attend it and they could take strategic getaways. I often found that families with young kids right around 6, 7, 8 months were so exhausted, they couldn't even learn the language any longer. They just needed a break. They needed to go to a nice, not necessarily high cost, but a hotel with electricity and some decent water and just take it easy for a few days. Single people need that too, but not for quite as long, and sometimes not by themselves. So it's a good idea to include a budget line item for those strategic getaways. As a therapist, if you are a counselor or a qualified therapist, screen for and treat all of these things that I've mentioned, but please make sure you help them with the grieving that needs to be done and those fundamental identity issues. Sometimes people who haven't been overseas and gone through a cross-cultural adjustment don't recognize. So I'm encouraging people who help sojourners who need help to recognize the grieving and the identity issues. Who are they in the final analysis? So discomfort and difficulty are not bad, as we know. They promote growth. Remember that Rubin and Keeley quote, that embracing the discomfort is important to ultimate success in understanding the culture. Isaiah 48:10 says, see, I have refined you, though not as silver. I have tested you in the furnace of affliction. And Romans 5 insists that our sufferings produce perseverance, character, and hope. So the discomfort and difficulty, the crucible part of cross-cultural adjustment, is not necessarily a bad thing. They are going to go through all these things that I have mentioned and that are coming up here on the screen. But they can promote a wonderful growth if we help them get through that stripping and accept the refinement of the crucible, accomplish those 7 tasks, hang their identity on the cross, and become graceful aliens and sojourners. And I would just say to a number of you too, that the 7 tasks are outlined in the Sojourner Workbook. And often I have found that people in their 3rd, 4th, 5th term need to review one of those. They might need to review grieving and losses, or they might have done well at Sabbath and resting at first, but with a whole bunch of transitions, they're not doing well any longer. So feel free to use the workbook for any time in a sojourner's life, even if it's not their first term, to help them get back on track and be resilient. And we have just about 5 minutes. So Lisa, does anybody have an observation or question we should entertain?
Yeah, I think we do have time for a question or two, and there is one. If there are more, feel free to send them to me now. But one person was asking about specifically the idea of you have your host culture, your home culture, and God's values, and was asking specifically about how to practice entering into a host culture, specifically one that you're newly negotiating, and learning and being respectful of it, but still maintaining a clear sense of what God's values are, and when those values differ, when you feel like they differ, how to respectfully negotiate that. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And it's not an easy question to answer because it's not easy to do. If you can find a person who's your home culture, that's been in the culture a lot longer than you have, and pick their brain, that can be very helpful. If you respect how they have adapted to the culture they're in. Sometimes you can find a host culture person who speaks English well, or who maybe has visited the US, who can give you, a perspective. Sometimes you just kind of have to flounder along. Here's a good example that's difficult in a number of cultures, and that's bribery. From a US or perhaps European culture perspective, one can look at that and just think, well, it's always wrong, and take a very black or white approach. If you really interview and understand some members of the host culture, you might find a very different viewpoint. Then you still have to wrestle it through and pray it through, thinking, given how they look at it, given what I've been taught, what is the correct way to act here? And I'm not going to tell you the answer, because it's something that we have to prayerfully wrestle through. That's why it takes time, and the adjusting intellectually and culturally, I think, is a task that can take years to continually work at. And even that being said, I know people I highly respect who are very functional, very well adapted in the culture. And depending on where they are and who they interact with the most, they might have a different position on something like how to handle bribes. But we have to prayerfully think it through.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good, complex question and deserves some complex thought. Somebody else asked, could you touch a little bit about helping young transition, or maybe in the time we have, talk about some resources for helping young children in transition? They said it's the hardest and most stressful thing for us 6 months in so far has been parenting, and wants to know if there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
Oh, well, that could be a whole other webinar. Yes, that's a difficult one. I think one of the things that I did with my own kids was lighten up a little bit in terms of some of the limits and the expectations when they're going through transition. You can't lighten up completely, or you have absolute chaos and they don't know, where the boundaries are. But to extend them a little bit of grace. And children have a lot of loss too, and they are grieving them. Some of their irritability and their annoyance is that they're missing things, and they're missing how things used to be. And if they can understand words at all, it can be helpful to sit them down. I once took my 2-year-old daughter on my lap and said to her, I wasn't sure how well she understood it. I said, Mommy misses X, Y, and Z too, and it makes me sad. So it's okay to be sad, but we still need to act in certain ways. I still need you to do X, and you still need me to do Y. So empathizing with their real emotions from your own point of view, and yet insisting that there are certain ways that we're going to behave just because we need to keep life together, is a good thing to do.
Thanks. Final question that I will answer for you, because you have actually already done the work. Somebody else asked specifically about more information about grieving, and thankfully Connie has already put that in a webinar form for us. So I just sent the link to everybody in the chat here. The webinar called Good Morning is about learning how to grieve well, and it is excellent, and I highly recommend it for learning how to do the work of grieving that all of us as cross-cultural workers need to do. So,
and for kids, there's a book called The Grief Tower, something like that. Lisa, can you?
Yep.
I can't pull up the author's name at the moment. Can you?
It's Lauren Wells.
That's a good reference.
Yep.
Yes, Lauren Wells has written a book for third culture kids called The Grief Tower. So they would have to be a little bit older than 4 or 5 probably to profit from not the kids, but the work with them. But yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Connie. I think we'll wrap up there, everybody. Thanks so much for coming, and Connie, thank you very much for
You're welcome.
the
My
years
pleasure.
and years of work that have gone into this, and distilling it for us is very, very helpful. So we appreciate you. Hope everybody else has
Bye, everybody.
excellent day.